Behind the Screen, where we discuss all things concerning running a successful tabletop game. Dan, what have you got for us today?
Well, Dungeons and Dragons or role-playing games in general generally have a number of, wizards call them pillars, core building blocks that the game is built around.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we will be focused on the pillar that provides us the stench of blood, the sounds of clashing steel, the screams of your wizard as they run away from the bloodbath. Yes, today we are talking about combat.
Role-playing.
Yeah. Yes. So, yes, combat.
It's funny how those two blur.
Maybe, yeah. One eats into the other.
So, I think specifically if we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons, combat is a very big part of the game for a lot of people. Arguably, it can get more attention from a lot of people than the two other pillars being, role play and exploration. Case in point, one of our entire sections is about a build and sort of like how fighty a lot of the time a character can be, for example. Now, given that combat is so important, it is very easy to run combat that isn't particularly great. It's just not a particularly great experience. So I just wanted to, I've got like 3 points that I kind of wanted to go through to kind of help budding DMs or, remind more experienced DMs how to keep their combats more exciting, entertaining, visceral, and fun, actually.
Go for it. Awesome.
So, when it comes to combat, a lot of my experience comes from the fact that I first started playing Dungeons and Dragons properly during 4th edition, which was very combat focused.
Yes, it was.
yes, it was. One of the biggest problems is that it can take an extremely long time. So our first question is, why, as a DM, are you throwing a combat at your players? I'm also going to ask, how do we make that combat interesting when you do throw it at your players? And then arguably, kind of very importantly, how do you end combat? Which may seem like a straightforward question, but we'll get around to that.
First question is, why combat?
Why combat? Yeah.
Why combat?
Why combat?
Why fight? So, yes, we're in 4th edition. Because combat could take such a long time, I found that the combats that I did throw at my players had to be there for very, very specific reasons. I didn't really have enough time around the table to throw, in inverted commas, meaningless combats at them.
Random encounters.
Yeah. Now, as I say, 5th edition is kind of better at the length of combat than say 4th edition was, but it can still kind of drag out. So I still like to have these kind of story beats, which, if nothing else, kind of frame a combat within your campaign well better. It feels like a natural progression from non-combat through rolling initiative to combat, instead of like a typical Final Fantasy slide screen from the world map into the fight map. It can feel a bit juxtaposed.
I feel you're criticizing my Final Fantasy game.
So why? Yeah, and if you can ask yourself and then answer, why are the PCs going into a combat? Again, much like we've spoken about in the past, kind of asking the why allows you to answer a lot of the questions that you'll then go on to ask yourself going forward. Are they chasing a villain? Who are these opponents that the party are about to face? Are they enemies? Are they a random encounter? If they are enemies of the big bads, that kind of gives you an idea of what abilities these people might have. If it's an evil necromancer, then perhaps your enemies are going to be from the undead category in the monster manual.
Is the main aim to create tension? Or excitement? Is that the main role of combat?
That's another question to ask yourself. Like, what are you, as a dungeon master, are you hoping to achieve from the combat beyond just kind of asking people to roll initiative and then spend the next kind of hour or so rolling dice at each other? Are you building, as you say, tension towards a plot? Like, are you trying to get to point B before the ritual happens or whatnot? Are you, as a DM, trying to encourage your players to use up their resources? It's all well and good leveling up and getting all new fancy things and fancy toys. So are you just looking for, in inverted commas, an excuse for your players to use their key points or bardic inspirations or spell slots? And don't get me wrong, like I'm not a massive fan of random encounters because I feel if they're truly random, they can just be a bit of a time sink. But quote unquote random encounters are good for resource expenditure for the party. But yeah, either way, asking yourself like, what are the stakes? So we've got to stop the ritual. Asking those stakes then kind of gives you an idea of what the end goal of that combat is, because if you're saying to yourself that the point of this combat is for your PCs to defeat the baddies, yay! There could be so much more. If you're not just beating up the skeletons, you're beating up the skeleton bodyguards on the stairs up to the pulpit where the ritual is about to happen, which will turn the kingdom into a necrotic landscape. Like, you've just introduced stakes, you've introduced story back into the combat pillar, and it gives your players some kind of forward momentum. Do you necessarily have to defeat the skeletons? Like, it's that sort of, to win the encounter, it's that sort of question.
I quite like you touched on it briefly, I quite like the idea of using combat as an opportunity for your players to use new items and new skills.
Yes.
It's like, if you have a level 5 wizard in your party, as a DM, you have to give them a combat scene with loads of little minions all bunched together just so he can do a fireball. I think that should be DMing 101. Give it to them once and then never let them use fireball again. That's really what you should be doing.
Every minion has counterspell.
Yeah, I mean, that is another important thing. Whether your players having fun is still the most important reason why you throw a combat at them. Sometimes it's good to let the players kind of stretch their legs and just feel a bit awesome. So, sometimes it's fun just to throw, I don't know, 10 goblins at a level 15 party, just so they can roll around a bit, like a dog rolling around in mud. First things first, ask yourself the why. When it comes to actually creating your encounter, so you've got an idea of what they're going to be fighting, why they're going to be fighting it. How do you go about creating it? So, I don't know whether you will consider this controversial, but I'd like everyone to repeat after me. Combat balance is a myth.
Combat balance
is a myth.
A myth. Absolutely.
But there's CR ratings, DM Dan, in the DMG, and in Xanathars they revised it. You can there's a table, you can read it. Like, it's
absolute codswallop. No. So you're absolutely right. Like, every monster has a CR rating, and there are official and unofficial tools to help you build balanced encounters using the CR rating, available all over the place. I get that. That does not obtain you perfect balance in your combats. For a start, if it did obtain you perfect balance, it would be boring as all hell, most likely.
I mean, I've got a monster called a Shade, which shows you how broken CR can be.
Absolutely, right? So there is this kind of ongoing battle of narrative versus the combat rating. What's in this combat? Like, how many of the things are they fighting? If you've set out in the narrative that the gates to the castle are guarded by 4 bugbears, so then the encounter is probably going to have 4 bugbears. But if that's a different story if your party are level 2 compared to level 10. There's still 4 bugbears. But that's not to say that the level 10s or the level 2s are going to have more or less fun than the other, because the balance is different. Sure, you can look at the CR, and I mean, I would suggest using the CR as a literal guide to roughly how powerful something is. But when it comes to even the concept of CR kind of stretches itself out of shape when you start getting to higher levels. Like a CR2 ogre is terrifying to a level 1 PC, but really, is a CR15 monster as scary to a level 10? It starts to get a bit squiffy.
Yeah, and it depends on the circumstances, because is your party just going into combat, or is this their third combat?
Precisely.
What resources have they expended? What allies have they got? What is the terrain? What kind of spells have they got prepared? There's quite a lot of variables.
Yeah, interesting you bring that up. So the other thing that a combat rating does not take into consideration is everything else. Everything else.
And
how are the party?
How skilled
are
your
the
players
party doing? But also
composition of party and everything.
composition
as
of party, even stepping kind of further out from that, the environment, the hazards within the arena with which you're going to be staging this fight, any traps or any other dangers generally don't have like a CR. You can't account for the CR of a thunderstorm that's making it harder for your ranger to shoot from the back. So that inherently changes the balance of your combat encounter. Should you avoid it? Absolutely not. Because
So what is the answer?
Combat creation is a bit of an artistry. Like, it does come to a point where you just have to, like, by all means use a CR to get a rough idea, but over time it'll just kind of feel, you'll be able to look at things and go, yeah, they're probably going to trounce through this, or this could be an interesting predicament that they find themselves in. But when you're thinking up an encounter, I think it's also massively important to think about the environment, the hazards, the traps. Now, 4th edition did do this very, very well. There were a lot of somewhat clunky environmental hazard rules. And to be fair, some of those kind of hazardous ideas come back in later 5th edition books like Xanathar's and Tasha's. But the place that you're going to be fighting is just as important as the combat for making it fun, exciting, and memorable. So always kind of bear that in mind. Because if nothing else, having cool environments allows your players that extra level of expression. There's a reason why in Mortal Kombat games every character has their own set of fatalities, but then the level itself also has its own set of fatalities. For example. And in terms of balance, another thing that throws it out the window is the example that I always go to when it comes to your opponents or you being in an advantageous or disadvantageous position is, it's one thing to fight a ghost. It's another thing to fight a ghost in a room with crushing walls. The CR of the ghost stays the same. But if a combat encounter you design is naturally designed to put the PCs on the back foot, then that's fine. Realistically, a lot of your creatures that they'll be fighting are living, breathing things, right? Like, they have their own personalities and survival instincts a lot of the time. So if you've got a goblin with a bow and they have a tall wall they could stand on and shoot down from, why wouldn't the goblin stand on? Oh, but the fighter can't hit them. Does it matter? It's stuff like that. On the flip side, if you have an arena planned, like in your mind, you've got that kind of thought out. If your players then engineer something to create an advantage for themselves within that fight arena, then kudos. Sure, you may have just completely neutered a combat encounter and turned it from a hard slog into a cakewalk.
Like
that's
Mold
fine.
Earth,
Well done,
Mold Earth as a cantrip is actually kind of meant to do that, because you can actually create like a trench, a 5-foot deep trench to like get cover or create a wall, or
so
quite a useful cantrip.
It's very, very interesting that you bring that up, because Anton, when we played Prince of the Apocalypse, the party were in the Fire Cult's temple, their dungeon, and that was an extremely hard set of encounters for you, because you basically pulled everything at once. Like, everything was alerted and came to your locations. One of the only ways that you managed to get out alive is because you found a narrow walkway and then created a barricade with Mold Earth. Completely changed the scales, because you could then funnel and focus fire, and you came out on top.
I was disappointed. I thought they were going to jump into a trash compactor.
All right, yeah. I'm also thinking about the Aboleth encounter we had.
Yes.
Aboleth.
Where it was meant to be an underwater combat with an Aboleth, right? Except we have a cleric, and clerics have control water. And what I thought remembered happening was your squid just the water went whoop, and your squid fell on the earth, and then had a 5-foot walking speed or something.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So that
aboleths also get quite dangerous out of water. Like, you kind of want to fight them in water.
They're not nice, but they're more nice
hampered
on land. But yeah, no, absolutely.
One spell completely changes the CR. Call it danger of a creature.
The challenge of an encounter, but also the fact that you remember that as something worth remembering. Yeah. To me, that says.
By the way,
to me, that says that's a good thing, right?
Yeah, that was good. And that was a moment. That was a moment where I got to use my special spell to do a cool thing.
Precisely.
which was good. So that was a good encounter.
Yeah. So
And then I imagine you got slapped 6 ways to Sunday by an aboleth.
no, just the ranger. So
Mm.
we know roughly where we're going with this combat.
Why combat? Yes.
We know that it's an impossible task to create a fully balanced combat. Even still, combat is long. Like, it takes a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Generally speaking,
Mm.
like low levels, you can go through quite quickly because everyone's only got a couple of things they can do. But once the wizard's got 30 plus spells and the fighters running around with 3 attacks, and it can start to drag on. So
Yeah.
The next question then is, like, when should a combat end? Because the whole point is to have fun, right? And I think we've probably all been sat in a combat encounter where it's gotten to a point where we've just kind of gone, oh, we've been doing this for an hour and a half. Oh, I rolled to hit. Right, okay, yeah. You run the risk of falling into that trap if you let your combats run over.
You've actually had a recent example of this in the Explosive Elsewhere campaign, Cormier, where
Mhm.
we had the Null fight.
Yes.
And actually, I think there were like 3 Nulls remaining, and we killed the main undead Null chieftain.
We say we.
Here
The
out,
pain
here-
train. The
Pain train here
pain
and
train
there.
killed it.
Yes, yeah.
Right.
I mean, well, this is just it. Like, especially, when you start increasing the level of your campaign, if you start increasing the number of monsters in a combat, and generally speaking, there should be a number of monsters rather than just kind of solo monsters all the time. All of these things are increasing the time. If nothing else, it helps to kind of diversify the combat, because if, for example, one of the baddies is getting away because they've decided that this fight's not going their way, then you have, for example, the opportunity to turn this fight into a chase. Perhaps the monsters retreat to a more defensible location. So, it puts a little pause in. Do the players follow straight through and potentially fall into a trap, or do they stop? Do they regroup? Do they have a bit of role play? Do they approach the next combat from a different angle? I mean, if you're feeling really brave as a DM, perhaps the baddies throw down their weapons and surrender.
Well, interestingly, I've been looking up a system recently that introduces a morale mechanic.
Mhm.
That if they lose half of the group that they're fighting with, they start rolling on morale.
Yes.
If they fail, it's not just about running away. It's not like they fail the morale and run. It's, do they move to a new position and regroup? Do they surrender? Do they,
Yes.
like, if it's a bar fight, do they stand up and go, oh, okay, I'm sorry? Which I found quite an interesting mechanic, because you're right, like, sometimes fights just go on, and not every fight should be to the death.
Yes.
Because, sometimes people will break
Yes.
and flee the battlefield. So I found that quite interesting. So, I think that's maybe something that D&D is missing, a morale mechanic. Like,
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
if you're like half your group is gone, are you really going to stick around?
Precisely. And yeah, if nothing else, it helps to speed up combat. The chances are your players aren't going to feel cheated because the last 3 mooks decided that this wasn't worth their lives and have scarpered. And it just kind of puts a nice little bow on it. I suppose, again, we always go back to this, but kind of asking yourself, like, what is the story that we're trying to tell asking for? Prince of the Apocalypse was a bit of a weird one, because pretty much every single fight with cultists specifies they fight to the death. Okay, cool. But
And it was a super, super, super long dungeon.
it's super
as
long
well.
dungeons, yes.
Yeah.
I guess to recap, when it comes to making combat more exciting and then interesting for your players, I would argue first off, making sure you have a concrete reason why you're throwing a fight at your players. If there's a way for you to tie this combat inherently into the plot that's going on around, then the players will feel more invested, especially if you introduce stakes or other things beyond the combat. Accepting that unfair fights are usually the fun ones. There's a reason why we remember the story of David and Goliath, and it's not because it was a CR appropriate encounter. And understand that all good things come to an end, and sometimes when it's combat, that end ought to be sooner than it could be. Whilst I give this advice, tailor it to your tables. Some players really like the crunch of combat more than the other pillars of the game, but I find the more that you can reintroduce those other pillars to combat, the more fun and enticing it all becomes.
Awesome.
Well, I mean, we've learned a very valuable lesson today, I think. Combat balance
Fight
is
till
a
the death.
myth.
It's a myth.
And fight to the
You know,
death.
And always fight to the death. No. But I think with that stage, let's move on. Thanks for watching. We release segments like this from the Tavern Between Dimensions every Friday here on the Explorers of Elsewhere channel. Otherwise, if you want to listen to the episode in full, you can check us out on Spotify and Amazon Music.